long before the first whisper of Arthur's name echoed through the mist-shrouded valleys of ancient Britain, long before Merlin's staff first channeled the primordial energies that would reshape the destiny of an entire civilization, the Celtic people spoke in voices barely above breath about places where reality itself grew thin as spider silk stretched across morning dew. These were not merely geographical locations that could be marked upon maps or found through ordinary navigation. They were living wounds in the fabric of existence, doorways that breathed and pulsed with energies older than human memory, thresholds where the very concept of separation between what is seen and what remains hidden became meaningless as smoke dissolving into starlight. The standing stones that dotted the landscape like frozen sentinels served as markers for these sacred passages, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands that had touched them seeking connection to powers beyond mortal comprehension. The sacred groves, where ancient oaks intertwined their branches in patterns that seemed to spell words in languages never spoken by human tongues, provided shelter for those brave enough to seek audience with forces that existed before the first sunrise painted the world in colors. Yet among all these mystical thresholds, among all the countless doorways that connected the world of flesh and blood to realms where different laws governed the very nature of being, none held greater significance than the concept of islands floating beyond mortal perception, suspended in the space between heartbeats, existing in the pause between one breath and the next. These islands were not fixed points in any ocean that ships could sail. They were ideas given form, dreams that had achieved such intensity that they had crystallized into landscapes where time moved like honey dripping from a golden spoon, where the boundary between life and death became as meaningless as the distinction between yesterday and tomorrow. The ancient Celtic understanding of reality operated on multiple layers that interpenetrated each other like streams flowing into a vast underground lake, each layer containing its own truths, its own inhabitants, its own laws that bore only passing resemblance to the rules governing ordinary existence. The visible world, that realm filled with warriors sharpening their swords by firelight, with cattle lowing in morning pastures, with harvests that determined whether communities would survive the coming winter, with the daily struggles of survival that consumed the attention of those who had not learned to see beyond the obvious. This visible world represented only the outermost shell of existence. It was the skin of an apple that concealed the sweet flesh beneath, the surface of a lake that hid depths where strange creatures moved through darkness that had never known the touch of sunlight. Beneath this familiar surface lay the otherworld, a realm where gods walked freely among forests that had never been touched by mortal axes, where seasons could reverse their course at the whim of beings whose thoughts shaped reality itself, where mortals who stumbled through hidden doorways might find themselves guests at feasts that lasted centuries, while only moments passed in their abandoned homelands. This other world was not a single unified realm, but rather a vast archipelago of interconnected domains, each ruled by powers whose names had been old when the first humans learned to speak, each containing wonders and terrors that defied description in any language designed for ordinary communication. The other world manifested in countless forms throughout the territories where Celtic peoples had established their civilizations. Irish storytellers, their voices hoarse from nights spent weaving tales by flickering firelight, described the seed, those hollow hills that concealed entire kingdoms ruled by the Tuatha de Danann, the divine race that once held absolute dominion over Ireland before retreating into hidden sanctuaries when newer peoples arrived to claim the surface world. These hollow hills appeared as ordinary mounds to casual observers, their grass-covered surfaces giving no hint of the vast halls that existed within, halls where music played eternally and where the concept of aging had been banished along with all other forms of decay. Welsh bards, their harps tuned to frequencies that resonated with supernatural harmonics, sang of Anwn, the mysterious realm accessed through caves that descended into darkness without apparent end, through lakes whose surfaces served as mirrors reflecting not the sky above but landscapes that existed in other dimensions entirely, through enchanted forests where the trees themselves served as guardians preventing unauthorized passage. In Anwn, Aron the king held court in halls that gleamed with supernatural light that cast no shadows, where the hunting hounds never tired and the quarry never truly died, where the cycle of pursuit and capture repeated eternally in patterns that satisfied some cosmic need beyond mortal understanding. Yet among all these manifestations of the otherworld, among all the countless ways that the realm beyond ordinary perception made itself known to those with eyes to see and ears to hear, the image of the sacred island held particular power over Celtic imagination. Islands possessed inherent magical properties in Celtic thought, their very nature as land surrounded by water creating natural temples where the ordinary rules of existence could be suspended without threatening the stability of the broader world. The sea that encircled them served as both protection and barrier, a moat of salt and mystery that ensured only those destined or divinely guided could reach their shores. The water itself carried profound symbolic significance, representing transition and transformation in ways that land-bound locations could never achieve. To cross water was to undergo a form of death and rebirth, leaving behind one state of being and emerging into another. The journey across waves that might be calm or tempestuous, predictable or chaotic, served as a test that separated the worthy from those whose time had not yet come. More importantly, islands could appear and disappear according to supernatural will, materializing from fog banks that rolled in from nowhere, or vanishing beneath waves when mortals approached with impure intentions or hearts clouded by doubt. The earliest tales of these mystical islands emerged from Irish tradition, where storytellers wove accounts of Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, into the fabric of cultural memory so thoroughly that the boundary between myth and history became impossible to determine. Here, warriors who had proven their worth in battle found themselves welcomed into a realm where wounds healed instantly, regardless of their severity, where strength never diminished no matter how many challenges were faced, where the concept of aging became as foreign as the idea of breathing water or walking on clouds. The island's inhabitants possessed beauty that never faded, despite the passage of what would have been millennia in the mortal world, their features maintaining the perfection of youth, while their eyes accumulated depths that spoke of experiences spanning ages. Their wisdom deepened without the corruption of worldly concerns, without the compromises and disappointments that gradually eroded the idealism of those who remained in the ordinary world. They moved through their eternal paradise with grace that seemed choreographed by forces beyond human comprehension, their every gesture carrying meaning that would take mortal scholars lifetimes to decode. Yet this paradise came with a price that many who sought it failed to understand until it was far too late for regret. Those who entered often discovered they could never truly return to mortal existence, for even brief visits to their former homes might cause them to crumble into dust as centuries of suspended time caught up with their bodies in a single devastating moment. The stories told of heroes who had spent what seemed like pleasant afternoons in Tir na Nog, only to return and discover that everyone they had known had been dead for generations, that the very landscape had changed beyond recognition, that they themselves had become legends, whose reality was doubted by those who heard their names. Welsh tradition contributed its own vision of sacred islands through tales of Ynys Afalon, literally meaning the island of apples, a name that carried deeper significance than mere fruit cultivation, might suggest to those unfamiliar with the symbolic language of Celtic spirituality. Apples held profound meaning in Celtic culture, their round forms representing the cyclical nature of existence, their seeds containing the promise of future generations, while their flesh provided sustenance that connected the eater to the tree that had produced them, and to the earth that had nourished that tree's roots. The apple's ability to sustain life through harsh winters, when stored properly in cool darkness, made it a natural symbol for survival beyond death, for the preservation of essential vitality during periods when the visible world seemed to have surrendered to forces of decay and dissolution. The fruit's association with wisdom appeared in countless tales, where heroes gained supernatural knowledge through consuming apples from enchanted trees, their minds expanding to encompass understanding that had previously been reserved for gods and the most advanced spiritual practitioners. The transformation of these early island concepts into what would become known as Avalon occurred through a gradual process of cultural synthesis and storytelling evolution that spans centuries of changing political realities and religious influences. As Celtic tribes encountered Roman expansion with its organized legions and systematic administration, as they later faced the arrival of Christian missionaries whose message of salvation through faith challenged the older traditions of connection to natural and supernatural forces, their sacred narratives adapted while preserving core spiritual truths that transcended any particular cultural framework. The island sanctuary began to serve not merely as a destination for heroes seeking adventure or gods conducting their affairs beyond mortal observation, but as a refuge where the essential spirit of Celtic culture could survive intact regardless of external pressures. It became a repository for everything that might otherwise be lost to the relentless march of change, a place where the old ways could be practiced and preserved, even as the surface world transformed beyond recognition. Archaeological evidence suggests that actual islands held special significance for Celtic religious practices, their physical separation from the mainland providing both practical and symbolic advantages for those who sought to maintain connection with supernatural forces. Druids, the priestly class who maintained oral traditions spanning countless generations and conducted sacred rituals, whose precise forms had been refined over centuries of practice, often established their most important sanctuaries on islands or peninsulas, where the surrounding water created natural barriers against casual intrusion. These locations provided the isolation necessary for complex ceremonies that might last for days or even weeks, rituals that required participants to achieve states of consciousness incompatible with the distractions of ordinary life. The physical act of crossing water to reach these sacred spaces reinforced the spiritual journey required to access divine wisdom. Each stroke of the oar or step across a causeway serving as a meditation that prepared the seeker for encounters with forces that demanded absolute focus and unwavering intention. The island sanctuary also functioned as a repository for cultural memory in societies that transmitted knowledge through oral tradition rather than written records. In a world where libraries could be burned and manuscripts destroyed by invaders who cared nothing for the wisdom they contained, certain locations became associated with the preservation of essential stories, genealogies, and spiritual teachings that defined a people's identity and connected them to their ancestors across the gulf of time. The mystical island represented the ultimate such repository, a place where all knowledge remained safe from the destructive forces of war, invasion, or cultural change that periodically swept across the surface world like storms that left devastation in their wake. Heroes who reached these islands often gained access to wisdom that had been preserved since the world's beginning, returning with prophecies that illuminated the path forward, magical objects that provided advantages in the struggles that awaited them, or understanding that could benefit their entire people for generations to come. As Celtic societies encountered Roman expansion and later Christian influence, the concept of the sacred island evolved to accommodate new spiritual frameworks, while maintaining its essential character as a bridge between worlds, a threshold where different realities could meet without destroying each other. The island's role as a mediator between realms became even more pronounced, serving as a space where different religious traditions could coexist without losing their individual integrity, where the old gods might retreat rather than disappear entirely, where Christian saints could establish monasteries that honored both new faith and ancient wisdom. The geographical reality of Britain itself, an island nation surrounded by smaller islands that dotted its coastline like jewels scattered around a crown, provided perfect physical correlation for these spiritual concepts. The numerous islands off the British coast, from the Orkneys in the far north where the sea seemed to merge with the sky, to the Scillies in the southwest where subtropical plants grew in defiance of the latitude, offered tangible locations where storytellers could anchor their otherworldly narratives while maintaining the ambiguity that allowed these tales to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Yet the mystical islands of Celtic tradition transcended specific geographical identification, existing simultaneously as real places that could theoretically be visited, and as spiritual metaphors accessible through faith and vision, rather than merely through sailing ships across physical waters. This dual nature allowed the islands to serve different functions for different seekers, providing concrete destinations for those who needed tangible goals while offering symbolic journeys for those whose quests were primarily internal. The figure of the wounded or sleeping hero became central to island mythology during the period when Celtic societies faced their greatest challenges from external forces that threatened to overwhelm their distinctive cultures entirely. Celtic tradition held that great leaders did not simply die and disappear into whatever afterlife awaited ordinary mortals, but withdrew to sacred islands where they remained in suspended animation, their bodies preserved in states between life and death, ready to return when their people faced their greatest need. This concept served multiple functions that addressed both practical and spiritual requirements of communities facing uncertain futures. It provided comfort during times of crisis, assuring people that their greatest champions had not truly abandoned them, but merely waited for the moment when their return would be most effective. It preserved the memory of exceptional individuals whose achievements might otherwise fade into legend and eventually into forgotten myth. Most importantly, it maintained hope for future renewal, promising that no matter how dark the present circumstances might become, the possibility of restoration remained as long as the sleeping hero continued his vigil in the sacred isle. Seasonal festivals reinforced the connection between mystical islands and the cycle of death and rebirth that governed both natural and supernatural worlds. Their timing aligned with moments when the barriers between realms grew thin enough for ordinary mortals to glimpse what usually remained hidden. During Samhain, when the boundary between worlds reached its thinnest point and the dead walked freely among the living, the islands of the otherworld drew closest to mortal perception, their shores almost visible through the mists that gathered at the edges of the known world. Witnesses reported seeing phantom landmasses appearing on the horizon where no land should exist, their outlines shimmering with light that seemed to come from within rather than from any external source. They heard distant music carried on impossible winds that blew from directions that corresponded to no point on any compass, melodies that stirred memories of experiences they had never actually had. They encountered boats that sailed without crews toward unknown destinations, their empty decks suggesting that their passengers existed in forms invisible to ordinary sight. These experiences reinforced belief in the island's reality, while emphasizing their fundamental otherworldly nature, their existence in a state that was neither fully present nor entirely absent from the world of everyday experience. The sacred groves that dotted Celtic territories served as terrestrial counterparts to the mystical islands, providing accessible spaces where similar spiritual experiences could occur without requiring the dangerous journey across supernatural waters. Oak, ash, and thorn trees, arranged in circular patterns, created natural temples where druids conducted their most important ceremonies, their branches forming canopies that filtered sunlight into patterns that seemed to spell messages in languages older than human speech. These groves often featured sacred springs or pools that reflected the water barriers surrounding mystical islands, their surfaces serving as mirrors that showed not the sky above, but visions of other realms that existed beyond ordinary perception. The enclosed spaces created by the intertwining branches felt separated from ordinary reality, as if stepping into the grove meant stepping partially out of the normal world and into a space where different rules applied. The transition from grove-centered worship to island-focused mythology represented not abandonment of earlier practices, but expansion of spiritual geography to encompass both earthly and otherworldly sanctuaries, creating a comprehensive system that addressed the full range of human spiritual needs. The apple trees that gave Avalon its eventual name grew throughout Celtic territories, their seasonal cycle providing a natural calendar for spiritual observances that connected human activities to cosmic rhythms. Spring blossoms promised renewal and hope after the darkness of winter, their delicate petals carrying fragrances that seemed to speak directly to something deep within the human soul. Summer fruit offered sustenance and abundance, the trees heavy with apples that represented the fulfillment of spring's promises. Autumn harvest marked the gathering of wisdom, the collection and preservation of what had been produced during the growing season. Winter's bare branches suggested death's temporary nature before inevitable rebirth, their stark silhouettes against gray skies serving as reminders that apparent endings were merely transitions to new beginnings. The apple's five-pointed star pattern, visible when the fruit is cut crosswise through its center, became associated with the five directions recognized in Celtic cosmology: north, south, east, west, and the center point that connected all others and provided access to realms that existed beyond ordinary spatial relationships. This symbolism reinforced the island's role as a central axis around which spiritual reality revolved, a fixed point in a universe of constant change where seekers could find stability and orientation regardless of how chaotic the external world might become. Warriors who sought the mystical islands often underwent elaborate purification rituals before beginning their journeys, preparations that might last for weeks or even months as they cleansed their bodies and minds of the contamination that ordinary existence inevitably accumulated. These preparations involved fasting that reduced the body's attachment to physical sustenance, meditation that quieted the constant chatter of thoughts that normally filled human consciousness, and the performance of specific tasks designed to prove their worthiness for the encounters that awaited them. The journey itself became as significant as the destination, with each stage representing different aspects of spiritual transformation that the seeker must undergo before achieving their goal. Storms might test courage, their howling winds and towering waves demanding that the traveler maintain faith even when all evidence suggested that survival was impossible. Phantom ships could challenge perception, their appearance raising questions about what was real and what was illusion in a realm where such distinctions had lost their ordinary meaning. Encounters with supernatural beings assessed moral character, their questions and challenges revealing the true nature of the seeker's motivations and the depth of their commitment to the quest they had undertaken. Only those who successfully navigated these trials could hope to glimpse the shores of the sacred isle, and even then, the island might choose to remain hidden if the seeker's heart contained any trace of unworthiness that the preliminary tests had failed to reveal. The sacred groves and mystical islands that had sheltered Celtic wisdom for countless generations would soon witness their greatest test. For the kingdom that Arthur had forged through decades of warfare and diplomacy stood on the precipice of destruction, threatened not by Saxon invaders or foreign armies, but by the poison of betrayal that had taken root within Camelot itself. The Round Table, once a symbol of unity and noble purpose, that had drawn the finest knights from throughout the known world to pledge their service to a vision of justice and honor, had become a breeding ground for jealousy and ambition that festered beneath the surface of courtly ceremony like rot spreading through the heartwood of a seemingly healthy tree. Mordred, Arthur's own son born of circumstances that the king had spent decades trying to forget, orchestrated a rebellion that would tear the realm apart with the precision of a surgeon wielding a blade designed not to heal but to inflict maximum damage, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate grievance. The signs of impending doom had manifested throughout the kingdom for months before the final confrontation, supernatural warnings that those with eyes to see recognized as harbingers of catastrophe, while others dismissed them as coincidence or exaggeration. Crops withered without explanation in fields that had produced abundant harvests for generations, their stalks turning brown and brittle despite adequate rainfall, and the careful attention of farmers who had never known their land to fail them. Wells that had provided sweet water since before anyone could remember ran dry overnight, their depths revealing only cracked mud where cool liquid had always waited. Strange lights danced across the night sky like omens written in fire by hands that belonged to no earthly being, their colors shifting through spectrums that included hues no human eye had ever witnessed before. These celestial displays lasted for hours, their patterns seeming to form symbols that the most learned scholars struggled to interpret, their meaning hovering just beyond the edge of comprehension like words spoken in a language almost but not quite understood. Knights who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in countless battles, their shields locked together in formations that had broken Saxon charges and defended Britain's borders against threats that would have overwhelmed lesser warriors, found themselves choosing sides in a conflict that pitted father against son, loyalty against ambition, the established order against forces that promised change, without specifying what form that change would take. The very foundations of Arthurian Britain trembled as noble houses declared their allegiances, dividing the realm into opposing camps that prepared for civil war with the grim efficiency of veterans who understood exactly what such conflict would cost. Mordred's rebellion had gained momentum through careful manipulation of existing grievances and the exploitation of Arthur's prolonged absence during his continental campaigns, a strategy that demonstrated the usurper's understanding of political dynamics that his father had perhaps grown too idealistic to fully appreciate. While the king pursued his vision of a Christian empire that would unite Britain with European allies in a grand coalition against the forces of darkness that threatened civilization itself, his illegitimate son cultivated support among nobles who felt neglected by Arthur's ambitious foreign policies. The supporters who rallied to Mordred's banner included seasoned warriors who resented being left behind during glorious campaigns that offered opportunities for honor and advancement, their swords growing dull from disuse, while younger knights earned renown in battles fought on distant shores. Ambitious lords who saw opportunity in chaos joined the rebellion, calculating that the disruption of established hierarchies might allow them to claim positions and territories that would otherwise remain forever beyond their reach. Those who harbored ancient grudges against Arthur's reign, grievances that had festered for decades beneath masks of loyal service, finally saw their chance to settle scores that they had never truly forgiven. The usurper had also secured alliances with Saxon chieftains who viewed the civil war as an opportunity to reclaim territories lost during Arthur's earlier victories. their warriors eager to avenge defeats that had humiliated their people and forced them to accept peace terms that grated against their pride. These foreign allies brought not only additional military strength, but also a symbolic dimension to the conflict that transformed it from a dispute over succession into a fundamental challenge to everything Arthur had achieved during his reign. The final march toward Camland began when Arthur received word of Mordred's open declaration of kingship and his seizure of Camelot, news that reached the aging monarch through messengers whose exhausted horses and haunted expressions conveyed the gravity of the situation before they spoke a single word. The king, weathered by decades of warfare and the weight of crown and sword that had never grown lighter despite the passage of years, gathered his remaining loyal forces for what he knew would be his ultimate battle. The army that assembled under Arthur's banner represented the last flowering of the Round Table's ideals, a gathering of warriors who had chosen honor over expedience and loyalty over self-interest in a world that increasingly rewarded neither virtue. Knights who had served through the golden years of Camelot, their armor bearing the marks of countless campaigns and their bodies carrying scars that mapped the history of Arthur's reign, answered the summons with the grim determination of men who understood that this battle would determine not merely who ruled Britain, but whether the civilization they had spent their lives building would survive at all. Grizzled veterans of the Saxon Wars, men whose youth had been spent in desperate struggles against invaders who had seemed unstoppable, until Arthur united the British kingdoms against them, rode alongside younger warriors inspired by tales of Arthurian glory that they had heard since childhood. These newer knights had grown up in a world shaped by Arthur's achievements, a world where the rule of law had replaced the chaos of constant warfare, where justice was dispensed according to principles rather than the whims of whoever held local power. They fought not merely for their king but for the world he had created, understanding that Mordred's victory would mean the destruction of everything that made their lives meaningful. Yet even among these faithful followers, many sensed they marched toward doom rather than victory, their supernatural sensitivity alerting them to cosmic forces that had aligned against their cause. Dreams troubled their sleep during the march toward Camlan, visions of ravens feasting on fallen warriors, of blood soaking into earth that would never again produce crops, of a sun that set and never rose again. They spoke of these omens in whispered conversations around campfires, seeking reassurance from comrades who could offer none because they had experienced the same disturbing visions. The battlefield of Camlan stretched across a windswept plain bordered by ancient earthworks and standing stones that had witnessed countless conflicts throughout Britain's turbulent history, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, yet still bearing traces of symbols carved by hands that had turned to dust before Rome's legions first set foot on British soil. Archaeological evidence suggests the location held significance for pre-Roman tribes, its elevated position and natural barriers, making it ideal for decisive confrontations that would determine the fate of entire peoples. The field itself bore the scars of previous battles, weapon fragments, and bone shards occasionally emerging from the soil to remind later generations of the violence that had repeatedly stained this ground. Local legends spoke of ghosts that walked the plain on moonless nights, spectral warriors who continued fighting battles that had ended centuries before, their ethereal weapons clashing in silence while their mouths opened in soundless war cries. On this fateful day, the plain would witness the destruction of everything Arthur had built, adding new ghosts to the legions that already haunted its blood-soaked earth. Arthur's forces approached from the east as dawn broke over the battlefield, their banners streaming in the morning wind like prayers made visible, their colors bright against a sky that seemed unnaturally dark for the hour. The king himself rode at the head of the column, Excalibur at his side and the crown of Britain upon his brow, presenting the image of majesty, even as his body showed the accumulated toll of countless campaigns. His armor, dented and scarred from decades of warfare, gleamed with fresh polish applied by squires who understood they might be preparing their lord for his final battle, their careful attention to detail a form of devotion that required no words. The dragon banner of Pendragon flew above the royal contingent, its red silk rippling against the darkening sky, like a living creature straining to break free from the pole that held it captive. The symbol that had united Britain's kingdoms under a single purpose now led them toward a battle that would determine whether that unity would survive or shatter into fragments that might never be reassembled. Mordred's army occupied the western portion of the field, their ranks swollen with Saxon auxiliaries whose presence violated every principle Arthur had fought to establish during his long reign. The sight of foreign warriors fighting alongside British rebels filled Arthur's knights with particular fury, for it represented not merely political opposition, but cultural betrayal of the most fundamental kind. These were the enemies against whom they had struggled for decades, the invaders whose defeat had been Arthur's greatest achievement, now welcomed as allies by a pretender who claimed to represent Britain's future. Mordred himself appeared resplendent in armor that deliberately echoed his father's regalia, a calculated insult that proclaimed his intention to replace, rather than merely oppose, the established king. He wore a circlet that proclaimed his claimed kingship, its design close enough to Arthur's crown to assert legitimacy, while different enough to suggest a new era that would sweep away the old. The sword at his side, according to some witnesses, bore supernatural properties granted by dark powers that opposed Arthur's Christian mission, its blade seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The battle commenced with the traditional exchange of challenges and formal declarations, rituals that had governed warfare since before anyone could remember, their precise formulas providing structure for violence that might otherwise descend into chaos. Yet these rituals carried unusual weight given the familial nature of the conflict, each word laden with meanings that extended far beyond their literal content. Arthur's herald proclaimed the king's right to rule and demanded Mordred's submission, his voice carrying across the field with clarity that suggested supernatural enhancement, ensuring that every warrior on both sides heard the formal assertion of legitimate authority. Mordred's representative declared Arthur's reign ended and called upon all present to acknowledge the new king, his counter-proclamation delivered with equal force and conviction. The formal words masked the deeper tragedy unfolding before thousands of witnesses, a father and son who had reached a point where only violence could resolve their differences, despite the destruction such resolution would bring to everything they both claimed to cherish. The initial cavalry charges shattered the morning stillness with thunderous impact as mounted knights from both armies collided in the center of the field, their meeting point marked by a sound like thunder trapped within the earth itself. Lances splintered against shields and armor, their wooden shafts exploding into fragments that filled the air like deadly rain. Horses screamed as they fell, their massive bodies crashing to the ground and crushing riders who could not escape quickly enough. The carefully maintained formations that had been drilled into both armies through years of training dissolved into individual combats where personal skill and fortune determined survival. Arthur's veterans initially gained advantage through superior discipline and coordination, their years of fighting together allowing them to maintain cohesion even in the chaos of melee combat. They moved as units even when separated from their commanders, each warrior knowing instinctively where his comrades would be and what they would do, their coordination the product of shared experience that no amount of training could replicate. However, Mordred's forces possessed the desperate energy of rebels who knew defeat meant death. fighting with reckless courage that gradually offset their opponent's tactical superiority. As the battle progressed, the field became a maze of fallen horses, broken weapons, and wounded men calling for aid that would never come, their voices adding to a cacophony of suffering that seemed to rise toward the darkening sky like a prayer offered to gods who had turned their faces away. The pristine banners that had marked different contingents became torn and blood-stained, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish friend from foe in the swirling confusion of combat. Saxon war cries mingled with British battle shouts, creating a babel of violence that seemed to echo the fundamental divisions tearing the kingdom apart. The ancient standing stones that bordered the battlefield witnessed scenes of violence that surpassed even the tribal conflicts of earlier centuries, their impassive surfaces splattered with blood that would stain them for generations to come. Warriors who fell against these stones left impressions that some claimed could still be seen centuries later, their final moments preserved in marks that no amount of weathering could completely erase. Arthur himself fought with the fury of a king who saw his life's work crumbling around him, Excalibur carving through enemy ranks as he sought to reach his rebellious son. The legendary sword, forged in otherworldly fires and blessed with supernatural sharpness that no earthly blade could match, cut through armor and weapons as if they were made of parchment rather than steel. Its edge never dulled despite the countless blows it delivered, its balance remaining perfect in Arthur's grip, as if the weapon itself shared his determination to end conflict that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Yet even Excalibur could not overcome the mathematics of warfare. For every enemy Arthur struck down, two more seemed to take their place, their numbers replenished by reserves that Mordred had positioned for exactly this purpose. The king's personal guard, composed of the Round Table's most faithful knights, fell one by one, as they shielded their lord from the press of enemies seeking the glory of killing the legendary monarch. Each fallen guardian represented not merely a military loss, but the death of ideals that had sustained Camelot through decades of challenges. The tide of battle shifted repeatedly throughout the day, as different contingents gained temporary advantages, only to lose them when fresh enemies entered the fray. Gawain's sons led a charge that nearly broke Mordred's left flank, their ferocity driven by grief over their father's recent death and determination to avenge him against the forces that had contributed to his demise. Saxon reinforcements arrived at the crucial moment to prevent complete collapse, their fresh strength turning back an attack that had seemed on the verge of decisive success. Mordred's cavalry achieved a breakthrough that threatened Arthur's supply train, their swift horses carrying them behind the king's lines, where they could have caused devastating damage to the logistics that sustained the royal army. A desperate counterattack, led by knights who had served since the earliest days of Camelot, repelled the threat, but at a cost that further depleted Arthur's dwindling reserves of experienced warriors. The ebb and flow of combat gradually consumed both armies, leaving the field littered with the bodies of men who had once shared the same ideals and allegiances, their blood mingling in pools that reflected the darkening sky above. By afternoon, the battle had devolved into a series of isolated combats scattered across the bloody plain, the grand strategies and tactical maneuvers of the morning having given way to simple survival as exhausted warriors fought with whatever weapons remained functional. Many knights, their swords broken or lost in the chaos, continued fighting with daggers, maces, or even stones picked up from the battlefield, their determination to continue the struggle overriding any consideration of proper martial conduct. The formal codes of chivalric combat that had governed warfare during Arthur's reign dissolved under the pressure of mutual annihilation, replaced by the brutal pragmatism of men who understood they were witnessing the end of their world and had nothing left to lose. Arthur and Mordred finally encountered each other near the battle's center as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, their paths converging as if drawn by fate toward this inevitable confrontation that had been building since the moment of Mordred's conception. The king, despite his exhaustion and multiple wounds that would have incapacitated lesser men, still presented a formidable figure as he approached his son through the carnage that surrounded them on every side. Blood stained his armor and face, the crimson marks of combat that he had accumulated throughout the day's fighting. But his eyes burned with undiminished determination to end the rebellion that had cost so many lives. Excalibur remained sharp and true in his grip, its blade untarnished despite the day's carnage, as if the legendary weapon retained its otherworldly properties even in the midst of earthly catastrophe. The sword seemed to glow with faint inner light as Arthur raised it, responding to its wielder's resolve with supernatural energy that had not diminished despite hours of continuous combat. Mordred appeared equally battered, his armor bearing the marks of numerous encounters that had tested his skill and endurance throughout the long day of fighting. His sword showed chips and notches from striking enemy weapons and shields, evidence of the violence he had both inflicted and survived. Yet his stance remained confident as he faced his father, perhaps believing that destiny favored the younger generation over the old, that the future he represented would inevitably triumph over the past that Arthur embodied. The usurper's supporters had fallen back to form a rough circle around the combatants, their weapons lowered as they recognized that this duel would determine the outcome of the entire conflict more decisively than any amount of continued general fighting. Arthur's remaining knights created their own perimeter, ensuring that this final confrontation would proceed without interference from either side. The two circles of warriors, enemies who had been trying to kill each other moments before, now stood in temporary truce as witnesses to a combat that would decide the fate of Britain. The combat between father and son possessed a terrible intimacy that distinguished it from the anonymous violence that had characterized the rest of the battle, each strike carrying the weight of personal history that extended back to circumstances neither man had chosen. Every blow reflected knowledge of the opponent's fighting style gained through years of training together. When Arthur had taught his son the martial skills that Mordred now turned against him, every parry demonstrated understanding of weaknesses and strengths that only close familiarity could provide. Arthur's experience showed in his measured approach and efficient movements, the economy of motion that distinguished masters from merely competent practitioners. He conserved energy while seeking openings in Mordred's defense, knowing that patience would serve him better than the aggressive tactics that younger warriors often favored. His footwork positioned him for optimal leverage with each strike, his body mechanics refined through decades of combat into patterns that required no conscious thought. The younger man relied on speed and aggression, pressing attacks that forced his father to give ground, while hoping to land a decisive blow before his own strength failed. Mordred's youth provided advantages in raw physical capability, his muscles responding more quickly and recovering more rapidly than Arthur's aging body could match. Yet his technique, while excellent by any ordinary standard, lacked the subtle refinements that only decades of experience could provide. The duel continued for what seemed like hours to the watching warriors, though the actual duration was probably measured in minutes. Each exchange of blows tested both combatants to their limits, their weapons meeting with impacts that sent sparks flying into the gathering dusk. The sound of steel against steel rang across the suddenly quiet battlefield, the only noise in a space that had been filled with the cacophony of mass combat moments before. Excalibur's supernatural edge proved decisive when Arthur finally penetrated Mordred's guard, the legendary blade sliding between armor plates to inflict a mortal wound that no earthly physician could heal. The sword entered Mordred's body with almost surgical precision, finding the gap between protection that the usurper's armor had been designed to prevent. The wound was immediately fatal, though death would not come instantly, leaving Mordred time for one final act of defiance. Even as Mordred felt his life ebbing away, the warmth of his blood flowing from the wound that Excalibur had inflicted, he managed to summon strength that should have been impossible for a dying man. Using his remaining vitality in a final desperate strike, he drove his own sword through a gap in Arthur's armor, the blade piercing deep enough to ensure that both father and son would die from their mutual wounds. The two men stood locked together for a moment, their weapons buried in each other's bodies, their eyes meeting in a gaze that contained emotions too complex for words to capture. Then they collapsed to the blood-soaked earth that had witnessed the destruction of Arthurian Britain, their bodies falling almost simultaneously, as if choreographed by the same fate that had brought them to this moment. The warriors who had watched the duel stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they had witnessed, the death of both claimants to the throne in a single exchange of blows that had lasted only seconds. The death of both claimants effectively ended the battle, as surviving warriors from both sides recognized the futility of continuing a fight that had already consumed its primary protagonists. What purpose could further bloodshed serve when neither king nor usurper remained to claim the victory? The field of Camland fell silent except for the groans of wounded men and the cries of ravens gathering to feast on the carnage, their black wings casting shadows across bodies that had not yet grown cold. The Round Table's greatest knights lay dead or dying, their bodies scattered among Saxon mercenaries and British rebels in a final demonstration of the Civil War's devastating cost. The kingdom Arthur had spent his life building lay in ruins, its unity shattered and its future uncertain. The golden age of Camelot had ended not with triumph but with tragedy, not with the establishment of lasting peace but with violence that would echo through centuries of British history. As Arthur lay dying on the battlefield, his remaining strength ebbing with each labored breath, witnesses reported the appearance of a phenomenon that seemed to transcend the natural world entirely. Through the gathering dusk came the sound of oars cutting through water, though no lake or river existed near the battlefield, the rhythmic splashing suggesting a vessel of considerable size approaching through a medium that should not have been present. A strange mist began to rise from the blood-soaked ground, swirling and thickening until it obscured the view of distant hills and standing stones that had served as landmarks throughout the day's fighting. The fog possessed qualities that distinguished it from ordinary atmospheric moisture, its density varying in ways that seemed responsive to observation, its color shifting through shades that included hues not normally associated with water vapor. From within this supernatural fog emerged a vessel unlike any craft that had ever sailed earthly waters, its appearance so unexpected and so beautiful that even warriors hardened by the day's carnage found themselves staring in wonder. The funeral barge that materialized from the mist possessed an otherworldly elegance that contrasted starkly with the violence that had preceded its arrival, its presence suggesting that forces beyond human understanding had taken notice of what had occurred on this blood-soaked field. The hull of the mysterious vessel appeared to be carved from a single piece of dark wood that gleamed with an inner light, its surface smooth as glass yet somehow warm to the eye, inviting rather than cold. The grain patterns visible in the wood seemed to shift and flow like living water, creating designs that suggested meaning without quite resolving into recognizable symbols. The craft's sail shimmered with colors that had no names in mortal language, hues that existed somewhere between the familiar spectrum and something entirely other, beautiful in ways that defied description. The barge moved without wind to fill its sail or current to guide its passage, gliding across the misty ground as if the earth itself had become water to accommodate its journey. No human hand guided its course, yet it approached Arthur's fallen form with purposeful intent that suggested divine guidance, its path curving around obstacles that should have been invisible in the thickening fog. The vessel's movement possessed a grace that no earthly craft could match, its progress smooth and silent despite the rough terrain it traversed. 3 queens stood upon the barge's deck, their presence transforming the vessel from mere transportation into a sacred conveyance worthy of carrying a dying king to his final rest. Their appearance commanded immediate attention, their bearings suggesting authority that transcended any earthly rank or title. These were not ordinary women, not even ordinary royalty, but beings whose nature partook of something beyond the human, while retaining forms that mortal eyes could comprehend. The first queen wore robes of midnight blue that seemed to contain the depth of starless skies, their fabric flowing around her form in ways that suggested movement even when she stood perfectly still. Her face bore the timeless beauty of one who existed beyond mortal aging, features that combined the freshness of youth with the depth of ancient wisdom. Her eyes held darkness that was not absence of light, but presence of something else entirely, depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of her skull. The second queen appeared clothed in silver that reflected light from sources invisible to human eyes, her garments catching and amplifying illumination that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Her expression combined maternal compassion with the terrible wisdom of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless kingdoms, who had seen civilizations bloom and wither like flowers in accelerated time. Her presence radiated comfort that somehow coexisted with awareness of mortality's inevitability. The third queen's garments shifted between green and gold like sunlight filtering through forest leaves, the colors blending and separating in patterns that seemed to follow rhythms connected to natural cycles beyond human perception. Her features suggested both youth and ancient knowledge in a combination that defied natural law, her appearance changing subtly depending on the angle of observation. She embodied the vitality of growing things, the promise of renewal that persisted even in the face of apparent destruction. These mysterious queens moved with fluid grace as they disembarked from their supernatural vessel, their feet making no sound as they approached the dying king across ground that should have squelched with blood and mud. Their identities remained unclear to the few surviving witnesses, though some claim to recognize aspects of figures from ancient Celtic mythology in their bearing and appearance. Perhaps they were manifestations of the triple goddess who governed fate, death, and rebirth in the old religion, or otherworldly beings who served as guardians of the threshold between mortal existence and whatever lay beyond. Their purpose, however, was unmistakable as they gathered around Arthur's broken form with expressions of infinite compassion that seemed to acknowledge both his suffering and its cosmic significance. They had come for the king, and they would not leave without him. The queen's ministrations to the wounded king transcended ordinary medical care, their touch seeming to ease his pain while preparing his spirit for the journey ahead. Their hands moved over his wounds without quite touching them, their gestures leaving trails of soft light that lingered in the air before slowly fading. They spoke in voices that carried the sound of distant music, their words unintelligible to human ears but clearly comprehensible to Arthur himself, who responded with slight movements that suggested understanding and acceptance. The dying king's face, which had been contorted with agony from Mordred's blade, relaxed into peaceful acceptance as the queens performed their mysterious ritual. The lines of pain that had marked his features smoothed away, replaced by an expression of serenity that seemed impossible given the severity of his wounds. His breathing, which had been labored and irregular, became steady and deep, as if supernatural forces were sustaining his life for the duration of the journey to come. The process of moving Arthur to the funeral barge required no physical effort from the queens, as the king's body seemed to rise of its own accord when they gestured toward the waiting vessel. This levitation occurred with such natural grace that witnesses later debated whether they had observed miracle or illusion, though all agreed that no mortal hand touched the wounded monarch during his transfer from battlefield to barge. The movement was smooth and gentle, treating Arthur's broken body with reverence that acknowledged both his suffering and his significance. Arthur's armor, still stained with the blood of battle, began to gleam with renewed luster as supernatural forces cleansed it of earthly corruption, the crimson marks fading as if absorbed by invisible hands. His wounds ceased bleeding, though they did not heal completely, their edges closing just enough to prevent further loss of the vital fluid that sustained whatever remained of his life. The transformation suggested preparation for a journey, rather than treatment of injuries, preservation rather than cure. Before departing with their precious cargo, the queens attended to one final obligation that would mark the end of Arthur's earthly reign and the beginning of his supernatural existence. Excalibur still lay beside the fallen king, its blade unstained despite the day's carnage, as if the legendary weapon had remained aloof from the violence that claimed its wielder. The sword's supernatural nature had protected it from the contamination that marked every other weapon on the battlefield, its edge as sharp and its surface as bright as the day it had first been presented to Arthur. The first queen lifted the sword with reverence befitting its sacred nature, her touch causing the blade to emit a soft light that illuminated the gathering darkness. She examined the weapon carefully, as if reading messages inscribed in its otherworldly steel, her eyes tracing patterns that were invisible to mortal observation. After a long moment of contemplation, she nodded to her companions in apparent satisfaction, having confirmed something that required verification before the ritual could proceed. The return of Excalibur to its supernatural origins required a ceremony that transformed the immediate landscape around the funeral barge, reality itself bending to accommodate forces that operated according to laws unknown to ordinary physics. As the queen raised the sword above her head, the mist that had concealed the vessel's arrival began to swirl and thicken, creating the impression of vast waters where none had existed before. The sound of waves lapping against an invisible shore filled the air, accompanied by the distant cry of seabirds that should not have been present so far from any coast. The very ground seemed to ripple and flow like liquid, creating the illusion that the barge floated upon an actual lake rather than solid earth. The transformation was so complete that witnesses found themselves questioning whether they stood on land or had somehow been transported to the shore of some supernatural body of water. From these phantom waters rose a hand clothed in white silk, its fingers extended to receive the sword that had chosen Arthur as its wielder so many years before. The appendage appeared feminine and graceful, belonging to the same supernatural entity who had first presented Excalibur to the young king when he needed a weapon worthy of his destiny. The Lady of the Lake, as she had become known in legend, had returned to reclaim her gift now that Arthur's earthly mission had reached its conclusion. Her timing suggested that the sword's supernatural properties were never meant for permanent human possession, but were instead loaned for specific purposes that had now been fulfilled. Excalibur had served its function, enabling Arthur to unite Britain and establish the rule of law that had transformed the island from a collection of warring kingdoms into something approaching civilization. Now that function was complete, and the weapon must return to its source. The Queen's throw sent Excalibur spinning through the air in a perfect arc that seemed to defy natural law, the blade rotating with mathematical precision, while emitting flashes of light that briefly illuminated the surrounding mist. The sword's flight lasted longer than physics should have allowed, as if time itself had been suspended to permit proper completion of the ritual. The weapon seemed to hang motionless at the apex of its arc, its blade catching light from sources that existed in other dimensions entirely. When the sword finally reached the waiting hand, both weapon and appendage vanished beneath the phantom waters with barely a splash, leaving no trace of their presence except ripples that gradually faded into stillness. The Lady of the Lake had reclaimed what was hers, and Excalibur would rest in her keeping until such time as it might be needed again. With Excalibur returned to its otherworldly guardians, the queens completed their preparations for departure. They arranged Arthur's form upon a bier that appeared within the barge's hull, its surface cushioned with materials that seemed to shift between silk and flower petals depending on the viewing angle. The dying king's breathing had become so shallow as to be nearly imperceptible, yet his face maintained the peaceful expression that had settled upon it when the queens first touched him. His hands were folded across his chest in the traditional pose of royal repose, while his crown remained upon his brow as a symbol of authority that would persist even in death. The arrangement suggested not a corpse prepared for burial, but a sleeper prepared for rest, someone who would eventually awaken rather than someone whose existence had permanently ended. The funeral barge began its departure without ceremony or fanfare, simply fading back into the mist from which it had emerged. The few surviving witnesses reported that the vessel seemed to become translucent as it moved away, its outline growing increasingly difficult to distinguish from the surrounding fog. The sound of oars continued for several minutes after the barge itself had become invisible, gradually diminishing until only the natural sounds of night remained. The supernatural mist that had concealed the entire episode dissipated as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving behind only the blood-soaked battlefield and the bodies of those who had not been chosen for otherworldly rescue. The stars emerged overhead, their light cold and distant, offering no comfort to those who remained to contemplate what they had witnessed. Yet Arthur's departure from the mortal realm did not represent simple death, but rather transformation into a different state of existence. The queens who carried him away spoke of Avalon not as a destination for the deceased, but as a place of healing and preparation for future return. Their words, though incomprehensible to human ears, carried the promise that Britain's greatest king would not remain forever absent from the land he had loved and served. Instead, he would rest in the sacred isle's healing embrace until the kingdom faced its darkest hour and required his return to restore justice and unity. The concept of the sleeping king beneath Avalon's enchanted hills provided comfort to those who survived Camlan's devastation and witnessed the collapse of everything Arthur had built. Rather than accepting that their golden age had ended permanently, they could maintain hope that the once and future king would eventually awaken from his supernatural slumber to restore Britain's glory. This belief transformed Arthur from a historical figure whose reign had concluded into a messianic presence whose greatest triumph still lay in the future, when the kingdom's need would be so desperate that only his return could provide salvation. The mists that had carried Arthur's funeral barge away from Camlan's blood-soaked field concealed more than the dying king's passage to otherworldly sanctuary. Among the three queens who had appeared to guide Britain's greatest monarch to his final rest, one figure commanded particular attention from those few witnesses who survived the battle's carnage. Her presence aboard the supernatural vessel seemed both natural and startling, for she was no anonymous deity from Celtic mythology, but Arthur's own half-sister, Morgan Le Fay, whose transformation from royal princess to the most powerful sorceress in the mystical realm had become the stuff of legend throughout the kingdom. Morgan's journey from the halls of Camelot to the enchanted shores of Avalon had begun decades before Arthur's final battle, rooted in the complex web of family relationships and political machinations that had shaped the Pendragon dynasty from its earliest days. Born to Igraine during her marriage to Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall, Morgan had witnessed her mother's subsequent union with Uther Pendragon through circumstances that remained shrouded in magical deception and political necessity. The young princess had grown up knowing that her half-brother's claim to the throne rested upon foundations that included supernatural intervention and carefully concealed violence, knowledge that would profoundly influence her own relationship with power and magic. She understood from an early age that the world operated according to rules that were not always visible, that forces beyond ordinary perception shaped events that appeared to result from human decisions alone. The earliest accounts of Morgan's character described a precociously intelligent child who demonstrated unusual sensitivity to the supernatural forces that permeated Arthur's court, while other noble children played with wooden swords and toy horses, engaging in the games that would prepare them for their expected roles as warriors and ladies. Morgan gravitated toward the castle's oldest servants, listening intently to their stories of ancient gods, mystical creatures, and the hidden powers that supposedly influenced human affairs. Her fascination with these tales went beyond mere childish curiosity, for she began displaying an uncanny ability to predict weather changes before any visible signs appeared in the sky, to locate lost objects that had baffled searchers for days, and to sense the emotional states of those around her with accuracy that unsettled even experienced courtiers who had spent their lives learning to read people. These abilities marked her as different from her peers, setting her apart in ways that would shape her entire life. Merlin's presence at Camelot provided Morgan with her first formal introduction to magical arts, though the great wizard approached her education with considerable caution that reflected his understanding of both her potential and her dangers. The aging sorcerer recognized in Arthur's half-sister a natural aptitude for supernatural manipulation that exceeded even his own early abilities, a raw talent that could be shaped into something magnificent or something terrible depending on how it was developed. Yet he also sensed within her a fierce independence and questioning nature that made her unsuitable for the traditional master-apprentice relationship that had characterized magical education for centuries. Morgan would not simply accept teachings because they came from an authority figure. She would test everything against her own experience and reject whatever failed to meet her standards of truth. Instead of attempting to control Morgan's development, Merlin chose to guide her studies while allowing her considerable freedom to explore magical techniques that aligned with her particular talents and interests. This approach recognized that her gifts were different from his own and would flourish best if allowed to develop along their natural paths, rather than being forced into molds designed for other types of practitioners. Morgan's magical education proceeded along paths that diverged significantly from the male-dominated traditions that had shaped Merlin's own training, where the great wizard focused on dramatic displays of power designed to awe audiences and influence political events. Morgan developed subtler techniques that worked through natural processes rather than against them. Her approach to magic emphasized cooperation with existing forces rather than domination of them, enhancement of natural tendencies rather than imposition of external will. Her early experiments involved accelerating plant growth in ways that appeared to result from favorable weather rather than supernatural intervention, encouraging animal healing through techniques that seemed like skilled veterinary care rather than magic, and manipulating weather patterns in ways that appeared coincidental rather than obviously supernatural. These abilities made her invaluable during times of drought or disease, when her interventions could save crops or livestock without creating the fear and suspicion that more obvious magic might generate. The healing arts became Morgan's particular specialty as she matured from gifted child into accomplished young woman, her understanding of herbal medicine surpassing that of any court physician through a combination of academic study and intuitive connection with plant properties that seemed to transcend normal human knowledge. She could identify medicinal herbs by touch in complete darkness, determine the optimal timing for gathering ingredients based on lunar cycles and seasonal changes, and combine substances in ways that produced effects far beyond what their individual properties should have allowed. Morgan's reputation as a healer spread throughout Arthur's kingdom as word of her successes reached communities far from Camelot, carried by travelers who had witnessed her work or benefited from her treatments. Nobles who had exhausted conventional medical treatments sought her aid for conditions that had baffled experienced physicians, while common folk whispered that the king's sister possessed powers that could cure ailments thought to be divine punishment or demonic possession. Her healing chamber became a place of pilgrimage for the desperate and dying, its walls lined with bottles containing preparations that glowed with inner light and emitted fragrances that seemed to change depending on the observer's needs. The room itself seemed to possess healing properties, its atmosphere promoting rest and recovery in ways that could not be explained by the herbs and medicines it contained. Yet Morgan's healing abilities came paired with knowledge of their opposite applications, for understanding how to preserve life inevitably provided insight into methods of ending it. Her mastery of herbal properties included comprehensive knowledge of poisons, their effects, and antidotes, information that made her both invaluable ally and potentially dangerous enemy. Courtiers learned to treat Morgan with careful respect, aware that her pleasant demeanor and healing reputation concealed capabilities that could prove lethal if she ever chose to employ them for destructive purposes. The complex relationship between Morgan and Arthur evolved throughout their shared years at Camelot, influenced by the fundamental tensions inherent in their situation. As Arthur's half-sister, Morgan possessed royal blood that gave her legitimate claim to political influence and social status within the court hierarchy. Yet her gender limited the formal roles available to her within the masculine world of medieval kingship, confining her to positions that failed to utilize her full capabilities. Her magical abilities provided alternative sources of power that transcended conventional political limitations, but they also marked her as potentially dangerous in a Christian kingdom that viewed supernatural practices with increasing suspicion. The Church's growing influence at court created an atmosphere where Morgan's gifts, however beneficial their applications, could be interpreted as evidence of demonic influence rather than divine blessing. Arthur's attitude toward his half-sister reflected the broader contradictions of his reign, which attempted to balance Christian ideals with the pagan traditions that had shaped British culture for centuries. The king valued Morgan's healing abilities and appreciated her counsel on matters requiring supernatural insight, recognizing that her knowledge provided advantages that no purely conventional advisor could offer. Yet he remained uncomfortable with the extent of her powers and the independence they afforded her, aware that her capabilities could either strengthen or threaten his rule, depending on how she chose to employ them. The relationship combined genuine familial affection with underlying tension, as both siblings recognized that Morgan's abilities created a dynamic that could not be fully resolved within the existing social framework. Arthur loved his sister, but feared what she might become. Morgan loved her brother, but resented the limitations his kingdom imposed upon her. The arrival of Guinevere as Arthur's queen introduced additional complexity to Morgan's position at court, shifting the balance of female influence in ways that affected every aspect of her daily life. The new queen's presence relegated Morgan from her previous status as the kingdom's primary female figure to a secondary role that chafed against her proud nature and considerable abilities. Where Morgan had once been the most important woman at Camelot, she now found herself overshadowed by someone whose claim to prominence rested on marriage rather than blood or talent. More significantly, Guinevere's devout Christianity and suspicion of magical practices created an atmosphere where Morgan's supernatural activities faced increasing scrutiny and criticism. The queen made no secret of her discomfort with practices that she considered incompatible with proper Christian faith, and her influence over Arthur gradually shifted the court's attitude toward magic from cautious acceptance to active disapproval. The tension between the two women reflected broader cultural conflicts between old and new religious traditions that would eventually contribute to the kingdom's internal divisions. Morgan represented the ancient ways that had governed British spirituality for centuries, while Guinevere embodied the Christian future that was rapidly displacing those traditions. Their personal rivalry thus carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond their individual relationship. Morgan's gradual withdrawal from active court life began as a response to these mounting pressures, a tactical retreat that allowed her to escape the increasingly hostile atmosphere while maintaining her connection to the royal family. Yet this withdrawal evolved into something far more significant, as she discovered that distance from Camelot actually enhanced rather than diminished her magical capabilities. The sacred sites scattered throughout Britain's landscape called to her with increasing intensity, drawing her toward ancient stone circles, holy wells, and hilltop sanctuaries where the boundaries between natural and supernatural worlds grew thin. These locations provided access to power sources that dwarfed anything available within castle walls, while their isolation offered freedom to pursue magical studies without fear of observation or interference. The transformation of Morgan from court-based healer to wandering enchantress occurred gradually over several years as she established a network of sacred sites where she could conduct increasingly ambitious magical experiments. Her travels took her to the stone circles of the far north, where she learned to harness the earth's natural energies for healing and divination, their ancient stones resonating with frequencies that amplified her natural abilities. She studied with the remaining druids, who maintained hidden groves in remote forests, absorbing their knowledge of plant magic and seasonal rituals that had been passed down through countless generations. Most significantly, she began receiving visions that revealed the existence of Avalon itself, the mystical island that would become her ultimate destination and the source of her greatest powers. The visions that guided Morgan toward Avalon arrived during deep meditative states, induced through combinations of herbal preparations and ritual practices derived from pre-Christian traditions, their intensity increasing as her skills developed and her consciousness expanded to encompass perceptions that had previously been beyond her reach. These supernatural revelations presented the sacred island not as a distant paradise accessible only through death or divine intervention, but as an accessible reality that existed parallel to the ordinary world, separated by barriers of perception rather than physical distance. The visions showed her apple groves that bloomed perpetually regardless of season, their branches heavy with fruit that glowed with inner light even during the darkest nights. She saw healing springs, whose waters could cure any ailment, their surfaces reflecting not the sky above, but visions of other realms that existed beyond ordinary perception. She glimpsed libraries containing the accumulated wisdom of ages past, their shelves holding knowledge that had been preserved since before human civilization began. Most importantly, the visions revealed that Avalon required a guardian who could bridge the gap between ancient knowledge and contemporary needs, someone capable of maintaining the island's connection to the mortal world, while protecting its sacred nature from those who might exploit its powers for destructive purposes. Morgan recognized herself in this role, understanding that her entire life had been preparation for this responsibility. Morgan's first successful journey to Avalon occurred during a particularly intense vision quest conducted at a stone circle whose origins predated Roman occupation of Britain by millennia. The ritual required 3 days of fasting and continuous meditation, during which she gradually felt her consciousness separating from physical constraints and gaining access to otherworldly realms that had previously been visible only in dreams and visions. The transition from ordinary reality to Avalon's mystical landscape occurred so smoothly that she initially failed to recognize that she had crossed between worlds, assuming instead that she had simply discovered a previously unknown valley hidden among familiar hills. The landscape around her appeared natural enough at first glance, with rolling hills covered in grass and trees that swayed in gentle breezes. The reality of her situation became clear only when she encountered Avalon's existing inhabitants, supernatural beings who had maintained the island's sanctity for countless generations before any human had learned to perceive its existence. These entities appeared in forms that shifted between human and elemental manifestations, sometimes presenting themselves as ageless men and women of extraordinary beauty, other times revealing their true nature as personifications of natural forces like wind, water, fire, and earth. They welcomed Morgan not as an intruder who had stumbled upon their hidden realm, but as the successor they had long awaited, someone capable of serving as intermediary between Avalon's timeless wisdom and the changing world beyond its borders. Their greeting carried warmth that seemed to penetrate to her very soul, acceptance that she had never experienced in the mortal world where her gifts had always set her apart. The education Morgan received on Avalon transcended anything available in the mortal realm, encompassing not merely magical techniques, but fundamental understanding of the forces that governed existence itself. Her supernatural teachers revealed the true nature of healing, showing her that physical ailments often reflected spiritual imbalances that could be corrected through proper manipulation of energy flows within and around the human body. They taught her to perceive the connections linking all living things, enabling her to draw upon the life force of plants, animals, and even geological formations to power her magical workings. This understanding transformed her approach to healing from treatment of symptoms to correction of underlying causes, from intervention in physical processes to restoration of spiritual harmony. More significantly, Morgan learned to manipulate time itself within Avalon's borders, discovering that the island's unique properties allowed for the acceleration, deceleration, or even reversal of temporal flow, depending on the practitioner's skill and need. This temporal mastery proved essential for her role as guardian of ancient knowledge, as it enabled her to preserve information and artifacts from different historical periods within spaces where they could remain accessible, regardless of external changes. The libraries she established on Avalon contained scrolls from pre-Roman Britain, alongside prophetic texts describing events that would not occur for centuries to come, their contents preserved in perfect condition, despite the passage of time that would have reduced ordinary documents to dust. Morgan's mastery of Avalon's healing springs elevated her abilities far beyond conventional medicine into realms that bordered on resurrection itself. The island's waters possessed properties that could reverse aging, cure diseases thought to be divinely ordained punishments, and even restore life to those who had recently died under certain circumstances. Her understanding of these waters' properties required years of careful study and experimentation, as their power demanded precise application to avoid unintended consequences that could prove more harmful than the original ailments they were meant to address. The springs were not simply magical cure-alls, but sophisticated tools that required expert handling to produce beneficial results. The establishment of Morgan as Avalon's primary guardian coincided with her growing awareness of the kingdom's approaching crisis and her brother's eventual need for sanctuary. Her prophetic abilities, enhanced by the island's supernatural properties, provided clear visions of Camlan's carnage and Arthur's mortal wounding long before these events actually occurred. Rather than attempting to prevent the tragedy, Morgan recognized that Arthur's apparent death represented a necessary transformation that would ultimately enable his return when Britain faced its greatest need for heroic leadership. The cosmic forces that governed such matters operated according to patterns that could not be altered without creating consequences far worse than the events they were meant to prevent. The preparation of Avalon as Arthur's place of healing and rest required Morgan to transform significant portions of the island's landscape to accommodate a wounded king's specific needs. She cultivated gardens containing herbs with unprecedented healing properties. Their growth accelerated and their potency enhanced through magical techniques that drew upon the island's concentrated supernatural energies. The chambers she prepared for Arthur's recovery incorporated architectural elements that channeled these energies directly toward the spaces where he would rest, creating an environment where natural healing processes could proceed at rates impossible in the ordinary world. Morgan's relationship with the other queens, who would eventually accompany her to Camlan, developed through her expanding role as Avalon's guardian and her increasing involvement with supernatural entities from throughout the Celtic otherworld. These alliances reflected not merely personal friendships, but political necessities, as the preservation of ancient wisdom and magical traditions required cooperation among all surviving practitioners, regardless of their specific origins or allegiances. The queens who joined Morgan in rescuing Arthur represented different aspects of the triple goddess figure that had dominated pre-Christian religious practices, their combined presence ensuring that the dying king would receive care that addressed spiritual as well as physical needs. The magical preparations required for Arthur's rescue from Camlan's battlefield demanded months of careful planning and the coordination of supernatural forces from throughout the other world. Morgan's role as primary organizer reflected both her intimate knowledge of Arthur's condition and her unique position as intermediary between Avalon's timeless realm and the temporal world where the battle would occur. The funeral barge that would carry Arthur to safety required construction techniques that combined earthly craftsmanship with otherworldly materials, resulting in a vessel capable of traversing the boundaries between different planes of existence. As the time of Arthur's final battle approached, Morgan found herself experiencing the complex emotions of someone who possessed foreknowledge of tragedy, but understood the necessity of allowing events to unfold according to their destined pattern. Her love for her half-brother warred with her acceptance of his need to experience apparent death as prelude to ultimate transformation. The healing she would provide on Avalon represented not merely medical treatment, but spiritual preparation for a future role that would transcend Arthur's previous accomplishments as mortal king. Morgan's establishment as Avalon's primary guardian represented only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the mystical island's entire structure and purpose. The supernatural entities who had welcomed her arrival possessed wisdom accumulated over millennia, but they lacked the connection to contemporary human affairs that would prove essential as Britain entered its most turbulent period. The solution emerged through Morgan's discovery that Avalon could support multiple guardians simultaneously, each contributing unique abilities that would strengthen the island's capacity to serve as sanctuary and repository of ancient knowledge. The selection process for additional guardians followed patterns established in pre-Christian Celtic tradition, where sacred sites required protection by groups of 9 individuals representing different aspects of divine feminine power. Morgan's visions revealed potential candidates scattered throughout Britain and the Celtic territories beyond, women whose natural magical abilities had developed along paths that complemented her own specializations. These individuals possessed talents that ranged from weather manipulation and prophetic sight to shape-shifting and communication with otherworldly beings, creating a collective capability that far exceeded what any single practitioner could achieve alone. The first sister to join Morgan on Avalon arrived during the autumn following Arthur's coronation, when political tensions throughout the kingdom had begun generating supernatural disturbances that threatened the delicate balance between worlds. Morwenna of the Northern Isles brought with her mastery over oceanic forces that had developed through a childhood spent among communities whose survival depended upon reading weather patterns and predicting tidal changes. Her abilities extended far beyond conventional seamanship into realms where human will could influence wind direction, calm stormy waters, or summon fog banks thick enough to conceal entire fleets from enemy observation. Morwenna's physical appearance reflected her elemental connections, with hair that shifted between silver and deep blue, depending on lighting conditions, and eyes that seemed to contain the depth of ocean trenches. Her clothing consisted of materials that appeared to be woven from sea foam and kelp, yet felt as soft as finest silk to the touch. When she spoke, her voice carried the rhythmic quality of waves breaking against rocky shores, while her movements possessed the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable on land or beneath the water's surface. The chambers she established on Avalon incorporated pools connected to underground streams that somehow maintained connection with distant seas, allowing her to monitor oceanic conditions throughout the known world. The second sister, Branwen the Farseer, possessed prophetic abilities that surpassed even the most gifted seers of the mortal realm. Her eyes, which had turned completely silver from years of gazing into the streams of time, could perceive not just what would be, but what could be, the infinite branching possibilities that spread from every moment like roots from an ancient tree. She had foreseen the fall of kingdoms, the rise of heroes, and the slow dimming of magic from the world. Yet she had also seen something else, something that filled her with a hope she dared not speak aloud, a time when the barriers between worlds would thin once more, when the old magic would stir in its slumber and reach out to touch mortal hearts again. The third sister, Saradwen the Keeper, guarded the sacred cauldron of transformation, a vessel older than memory itself, said to have been forged in the first fires of creation. Within its depths swirled the essence of rebirth, the power to unmake and remake, to strip away all that was false and reveal the truth that lay beneath. Those who drank from its waters emerged changed, their souls purified of doubt and fear, their purpose crystallized into diamond clarity. But the cauldron demanded sacrifice, for nothing could be gained without something being given in return, and Saradwen had learned through countless ages that the greatest transformations required the greatest surrenders. Together, these 3 sisters maintained the delicate balance between the seen and unseen worlds, their combined powers forming a trinity of wisdom that had guided seekers since the dawn of consciousness. They had watched civilizations rise and fall, had witnessed the birth of religions and the death of gods, had seen humanity stumble and soar in its eternal quest for meaning. And through it all, they had remained constant, their purpose unwavering, to offer sanctuary to those who sought it, to provide guidance to those who earned it, and to preserve the ancient knowledge that would one day be needed again. The chamber in which they dwelt existed outside the normal flow of time, a pocket of eternity where past, present, and future coexisted in harmonious suspension. Crystalline formations grew from every surface, each one containing captured moments of profound significance. A child's first act of kindness, a warrior's final stand against impossible odds, a lover's whispered promise kept across decades of separation. These frozen instants of grace served as reminders of humanity's capacity for transcendence, proof that even in the darkest times, the light of the soul could shine with blinding brilliance. As the seeker approached the sisters' throne, they felt the weight of countless gazes upon them. Not just the 3 pairs of eyes that watched from the dais, but the accumulated attention of every soul who had ever stood in this place. Every pilgrim who had made the journey through shadow and doubt to reach this moment of reckoning. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would unfold, what truths would be revealed, what transformations would be set in motion. "You have traveled far," Arianrod spoke, her voice carrying the resonance of silver bells and distant thunder. "Through the mists of uncertainty, across the bridges of faith, into the depths of your own shadow. You have faced the guardians of the threshold and emerged not victorious, but transformed. This is as it should be, for victory implies conquest, and the path to wisdom is not one of domination but of surrender." Branwen's silver eyes flickered with visions yet to come. "We have seen your journey before you took your first step, have witnessed every choice you will make, and every consequence that will flow from those choices. Yet seeing is not the same as determining, for the future remains fluid until the moment it crystallizes into the present. You stand now at a nexus of possibility, a point where multiple paths converge and diverge, where the decisions you make will echo through generations yet unborn." Ceridwen stirred the waters of her cauldron, and images began to form in its depths. Scenes of potential futures, lives that might be lived, worlds that might be shaped by the seeker's choices. "The transformation you seek is already underway," she intoned. "It began the moment you first felt the stirring of discontent with the surface of things, the first whisper of longing for something deeper, something more real than the shadows that most mistake for substance. What we offer is not change itself, but the courage to embrace the change that is already occurring within you." The seeker knelt before the Trinity of Wisdom, not in submission but in recognition, an acknowledgement of the sacred nature of this encounter, of the privilege of standing in the presence of beings who had witnessed the entire span of human striving. In that posture of humility, they felt something shift within their chest, a loosening of bonds they hadn't known they carried, a release of tensions accumulated over a lifetime of resistance to their own becoming. "What do you seek?" The question came from all 3 sisters, simultaneously, their voices weaving together into a harmony that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequency of existence itself. It was a question that had been asked countless times in this chamber, yet it was always new, always fresh, always carrying the weight of ultimate significance for the one who heard it. The seeker considered their answer carefully, knowing that words spoken in this place carried power beyond their ordinary meaning. They thought of all the reasons they had embarked on this journey, the dissatisfaction with a life that felt hollow despite its outward success, the persistent sense that something essential was missing, the dreams that had called to them from the edges of sleep, promising a reality more vivid and meaningful than anything they had known in waking life. "I seek myself," they finally answered, and the words felt both inadequate and precisely right. "I seek the self I was meant to be, the purpose I was born to fulfill, the truth that has always lived within me, but that I have been too afraid or too distracted to acknowledge." The sisters exchanged glances that communicated volumes in the space of a heartbeat. Arianrod nodded slowly, her silver wheel beginning to turn with increased speed. "This is the only answer that matters. she said. All other seekings, for power, for knowledge, for love, for peace, are merely aspects of this fundamental quest. To seek oneself is to seek everything, for the self contains multitudes, encompasses universes, reflects the infinite in its finite form. Branwen leaned forward, her prophetic gaze piercing through the veils of time. The self you seek is not a destination but a journey, not a fixed point but an ever-expanding horizon. You will never fully arrive, never completely know, never entirely become. And this is not a failure but a gift. The joy of existence lies in the eternal unfolding, the perpetual discovery, the endless dance between what you are and what you are becoming. Saradwin lifted a ladle from her cauldron, the liquid within it shimmering with all the colors of possibility. To find yourself, you must first lose yourself. To become what you are meant to be, you must release what you have been. This is the paradox at the heart of transformation. That growth requires death, that expansion demands contraction, that the new can only emerge from the ashes of the old. The seeker understood, in that moment, that they were being offered not just wisdom but a choice, the choice to accept the full implications of their quest, to embrace the dissolution that must precede reconstruction, to surrender the comfortable certainties of their former life for the terrifying freedom of authentic existence. It was a choice that could not be made lightly, for once made, it could not be unmade. The path of transformation, once begun in earnest, allowed no retreat to the safety of ignorance. "I accept," the seeker said, and the words seemed to echo through dimensions beyond counting, rippling outward through the fabric of reality itself. "I accept the death of who I have been. I accept the uncertainty of who I am becoming. I accept the responsibility of who I am meant to be." The chamber blazed with light as the sisters rose from their thrones, their forms expanding to fill the entire space with radiance. The crystalline formations sang in frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. The cauldron's waters rose in a spiral of liquid light, surrounding the seeker in a cocoon of transformative energy. And in that moment of supreme intensity, the seeker experienced something that no words could adequately describe: a dissolution of all boundaries, a merging with the infinite, a simultaneous awareness of every moment of their existence, from birth to death and beyond. They saw themselves as they truly were, not a separate entity struggling against an indifferent universe, but an integral expression of that universe, a unique perspective through which existence experienced itself, a note in the eternal symphony of being. The vision expanded further, showing them the interconnected web of all consciousness, the way every thought and action rippled outward to affect the whole, the profound responsibility and privilege of being a conscious participant in the ongoing creation of reality. They saw how their struggles had served a purpose, how their wounds had opened them to compassion, how their failures had taught them humility, how every experience, no matter how painful, had contributed to the person they were becoming. When the light finally faded, and the seeker found themselves once again kneeling before the three sisters, they knew that everything had changed. The chamber looked the same, the sisters appeared unchanged, yet the seeker perceived it all with new eyes, eyes that had been washed clean of illusion, that could see the sacred shining through the ordinary, that recognized the miracle of existence in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of awareness. "You have received the gift of sight," Arianrod said, her voice now gentle, almost maternal. "Not the sight of the eyes, which perceives only surfaces, but the sight of the soul, which perceives essences. Use this gift wisely, for with greater perception comes greater responsibility. You will see suffering that others cannot see, but you will also see beauty that others cannot see. You will feel the pain of the world more acutely, but you will also feel its joy more deeply." Branwen smiled, and in her smile was the warmth of all the futures where hope triumphed over despair. "The path ahead will not be easy, for those who see clearly are often misunderstood by those who prefer the comfort of blindness. You will be called to speak truths that others do not wish to hear, to stand for principles that others have abandoned, to maintain faith when all evidence seems to counsel despair. But you will not walk alone, for you are now part of a lineage of seekers that stretches back to the dawn of consciousness and forward to its ultimate fulfillment." Ceridwen offered the ladle from her cauldron, and the seeker drank deeply of its waters. The liquid tasted of starlight and earth, of tears and laughter, of endings and beginnings. It flowed through their being like liquid fire, burning away the last vestiges of their former limitations, awakening capacities that had lain dormant since birth, activating potentials that would take a lifetime to fully explore. "Go now," the sisters spoke in unison. "Return to the world of form and time, but carry within you the memory of this place, the knowledge of what you truly are, the vision of what humanity can become. Be a bridge between worlds, a translator of mysteries, a keeper of the flame that must never be allowed to die. And when your journey in the mortal realm is complete, know that you will return here, to this place beyond place, to share what you have learned, and to prepare for the next stage of your eternal adventure." The journey back through the mist-shrouded passages felt entirely different from the journey in. Where before the seeker had moved through uncertainty and shadow, now they walked through a landscape that revealed its secrets willingly, that seemed to welcome them as a returning friend rather than a suspicious stranger. The guardians they had encountered on their inward journey now nodded in recognition, their fearsome aspects softened by something that might have been respect, or perhaps even affection. The seeker understood now that these beings had never been obstacles to be overcome but teachers to be learned from, that every challenge on the path had been precisely calibrated to develop exactly the qualities needed for the next stage of the journey. The shadow self they had confronted was not an enemy but an ally, a repository of rejected aspects that, once integrated, provided access to reserves of strength and creativity previously unavailable. The tests of faith had not been designed to break them, but to reveal the unbreakable core that lay beneath all their doubts and fears. As they walked, the seeker began to notice details they had missed on the way in, the intricate patterns in the bark of the ancient trees, the way the mist caught the light and transformed it into rainbow fragments, the subtle music that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath their feet. Everything was alive, everything was conscious, everything was participating in the great dance of existence. The boundaries they had once perceived between self and world, between observer and observed, had become permeable, allowing a flow of awareness that enriched every moment with profound significance. They thought about the life they had left behind, the world of schedules and obligations, of social expectations and material concerns. It all seemed so distant now, so small compared to the vastness they had touched. Yet they knew they must return to it, must find a way to live in that world while carrying the memory of this one, must learn to translate the ineffable experiences of the inner journey into actions and words that could benefit others. This, they realized, was perhaps the greatest challenge of all, not the journey into the depths, but the return to the surface, not the acquisition of wisdom, but its application, not the transformation of self, but the transformation of world through self. Many seekers, they intuited, had made the journey they had just completed, had received the same gifts, had experienced the same revelations, but not all had succeeded in bringing those gifts back, in maintaining their connection to the deeper reality while navigating the demands of ordinary existence. The path began to ascend, and with each step upward, the seeker felt the weight of the material world settling back upon their shoulders. But it was a different weight now, not the crushing burden of meaningless obligation, but the grounding presence of purpose and responsibility. They were returning not as the same person who had left, but as someone new, someone who carried within them a seed of light that could illuminate the darkness of the world. The mists began to thin, and familiar landmarks emerged from the obscurity: the twisted oak that marked the boundary between worlds, the standing stones that hummed with ancient power, the spring whose waters had first called them to begin this journey. Everything was as they had left it, yet everything was transformed by their new way of seeing. The ordinary had become extraordinary. The mundane had become miraculous. The everyday had become a continuous revelation of the sacred. As the seekers stepped fully back into the world of form and time, they felt a moment of profound gratitude. Gratitude for the journey they had been privileged to take, for the teachers who had guided them, for the challenges that had strengthened them, for the gifts they had received. They understood that this gratitude was not just an emotion but a practice, a way of orienting themselves toward existence that would help them maintain their connection to the deeper reality, even amid the distractions and difficulties of ordinary life. The sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the transformative fires they had passed through. Birds sang their evening songs, and somewhere in the distance, a stream murmured its eternal melody. The world was exactly as it had always been, yet the seekers saw it now with eyes that had been touched by eternity, and in that seeing, everything was new. They began to walk toward the village they had left. How long ago? It felt like years, though they knew that time moved differently in the realms they had visited. They wondered how they would explain their absence, how they would account for the changes that must be visible in their bearing, their gaze, their very presence. They wondered if anyone would understand, if anyone would believe, if anyone would be willing to hear the truths they now carried. But these concerns, they realized, were remnants of their old way of thinking, echoes of the fear and doubt they had worked so hard to transcend. The path forward was not about convincing others or proving anything to anyone. It was simply about being authentic, being present, being a living embodiment of the wisdom they had received. Those who were ready to hear would hear. Those who were ready to see would see. Their task was not to force transformation upon anyone, but to offer it freely to all who sought it. The days that followed the seeker's return were a time of profound adjustment, a gradual process of learning to live in two worlds simultaneously. On the surface, they resumed the routines of ordinary existence, the work that needed to be done, the relationships that needed to be maintained, the practical demands that could not be ignored. But beneath that surface, a deeper life continued to unfold, a constant communion with the realities they had touched in the realm beyond the mists. They discovered that the gifts they had received were not static possessions, but living capacities that grew stronger with use. The sight that had been awakened in them became clearer and more refined as they practiced using it, allowing them to perceive the hidden dimensions of every situation, the unspoken needs of every person they encountered, the subtle currents of meaning that flowed beneath the surface of events. They learned to trust this sight, to act upon its guidance even when it contradicted the apparent evidence of ordinary perception. The integration was not always easy. There were moments when the gap between what they saw and what others saw felt unbridgeable, when the loneliness of expanded awareness threatened to overwhelm them. There were times when they doubted their experiences, wondered if they had simply imagined the whole journey, questioned whether the transformation they felt was real or merely a pleasant delusion. In these moments, they learned to return to the practices they had been taught, the breathing that connected them to the rhythm of existence, the meditation that quieted the noise of the surface mind, the contemplation that renewed their connection to the source of all wisdom. Gradually, they began to attract others who sensed something different about them, something that called to the seeker within their own souls. These encounters were rarely dramatic, a conversation that went deeper than usual, a moment of unexpected connection, a question asked with genuine hunger for truth. The seeker learned to recognize these moments, to respond to them with the same patience and wisdom that had been shown to them, to plant seeds without attachment to when or how they might sprout. They also learned the importance of boundaries, of protecting the sacred knowledge they carried from those who would misuse it or trivialize it. Not everyone was ready to hear the truths they had learned, and forcing such truths upon unprepared minds could cause more harm than good. Wisdom, they discovered, included knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to reveal and when to conceal, when to act and when to wait. The seasons turned, and with each turning, the seeker's integration deepened. Spring brought renewal and the joy of watching new seekers begin their own journeys. Summer brought abundance and the challenge of maintaining inner stillness amid outer activity. Autumn brought harvest and the satisfaction of seeing the fruits of patient cultivation. Winter brought rest and the opportunity for deeper contemplation, for journeying inward to the realms that remained accessible to those who knew the way. Through it all, the seeker maintained their connection to the three sisters, to the wisdom they embodied, to the lineage of seekers that stretched across time. In dreams and meditations, they would return to the crystal chamber, would drink again from the waters of transformation, would receive guidance for the challenges they faced. These visits reminded them that they were never truly alone, that they were part of something vast and ancient and ongoing, that their individual journey was a thread in a tapestry of cosmic significance. Years passed, and the seeker who had once been a novice became a guide for others. They learned to recognize the signs of awakening in those they met, to offer the right word or gesture at the right moment, to create the conditions in which transformation could occur. They established places of sanctuary where seekers could rest and learn, where the old knowledge could be preserved and transmitted, where the flame of wisdom could be kept burning against the darkness of forgetting. Yet even as they took on the role of teacher, they never forgot that they remained a student, that the journey of awakening had no final destination, that there were always deeper depths to explore and higher heights to scale. This humility, they discovered, was essential to authentic wisdom, the recognition that no matter how much one learned, the mystery remained infinite, the source inexhaustible, the adventure eternal. As the seeker moved through the later stages of their mortal journey, they began to contemplate the question of legacy, not in the sense of fame or remembrance, but in the sense of what would endure beyond their individual existence. What seeds they had planted that would continue to grow and bear fruit long after they had passed from the world of form. They thought of the students they had guided, each one now carrying their own flame of awakened consciousness, each one touching other lives in ways that would ripple outward through generations. They thought of the sanctuaries they had established, the communities of practice that had formed around them, the traditions they had helped to preserve and transmit. They thought of the moments of genuine connection they had shared, the words spoken at crucial junctures, the silences that had communicated more than words ever could. But more than any of these external manifestations, they thought of the inner transformation they had undergone and helped others to undergo, the shift from fear to love, from separation to connection, from sleep to awakening. This, they understood, was the true legacy, the only legacy that ultimately mattered. Institutions could crumble, teachings could be forgotten, names could fade from memory, but the light of consciousness, once kindled, could never be fully extinguished. It passed from soul to soul, from generation to generation, an eternal flame that had burned since the first moment of awareness and would continue burning until the last. The seeker began to prepare for their transition with the same intentionality they had brought to every other aspect of their journey. They knew that death was not an ending but a transformation, not a loss, but a liberation, not a descent into darkness, but an ascent into greater light. The realm beyond the mists that they had visited so many times in vision and meditation would become their permanent home, and from there they would continue to guide and inspire those who remained in the world of form. They gathered their closest students and shared with them the deepest teachings, the ones that could only be transmitted from heart to heart, from presence to presence. They spoke of the unity that underlay all apparent diversity, the love that was the fundamental fabric of existence, the purpose that gave meaning to every moment of struggle and every instant of joy. They spoke of the responsibility that came with awakening, the call to serve that could not be ignored, the privilege of participating consciously in the evolution of consciousness itself. Remember, they said, that you are not separate from what you seek. The light you pursue is the light you already are. The wisdom you hunger for is the wisdom you already possess. The love you long for is the love you already embody. The journey is not about acquiring something new, but about remembering something ancient, not about becoming something different, but about recognizing what you have always been. They spoke of the challenges that lay ahead, the times of darkness that would test the faith of even the most devoted seekers. They spoke of the importance of community, of supporting one another through the difficult passages, of maintaining the connections that would sustain them when individual strength faltered. They spoke of the signs to watch for, the portents that would indicate when the time was ripe for action, the subtle guidance that would always be available to those who knew how to listen. The world will change, they said, in ways that cannot now be imagined. Old structures will fall, new ones will rise, and through it all, the eternal truths will remain constant. Your task is to be anchors of stability in times of chaos, beacons of light in times of darkness, voices of wisdom in times of confusion. You will not always succeed. You will not always be heard. You will not always see the fruits of your labors. But you must persist nonetheless, trusting that every act of love, every word of truth, every moment of presence contributes to the great work of awakening. The students listened with hearts full of gratitude and grief, knowing that they were receiving a precious transmission, knowing that the time of parting was approaching. They asked questions, sought clarifications, tried to absorb as much as possible of the wisdom being offered. And the seeker answered patiently, thoroughly, holding nothing back, pouring out the accumulated understanding of a lifetime devoted to the pursuit of truth. The final night came gently, like a soft rain after a long drought. The seeker lay in their simple bed, surrounded by the students who had become family, feeling the gradual loosening of the bonds that tied consciousness to form. There was no fear, only a profound peace, a sense of completion, a readiness to embrace whatever came next. As their breathing slowed and their awareness began to expand beyond the confines of the body, the seeker felt the familiar presence of the three sisters, felt the mists of the threshold realm gathering around them, felt the pull of the crystal chamber where they had received their first great initiation so many years ago. But this time, they knew they would not be returning to the world of form. This time, the journey would continue in realms beyond anything they had yet experienced. The students watched as a subtle light began to emanate from their teacher's form, a radiance that seemed to come from within, that grew brighter even as the breath grew fainter. They felt the presence of beings they could not see, heard music they could not quite identify, sensed the thinning of the veil between worlds, and in that sacred moment, they understood that death was indeed a doorway, that their teacher was not leaving them, but simply moving to a place from which guidance could be offered in new and more powerful ways. The seeker's final breath was a sigh of release, of surrender, of homecoming, and as consciousness slipped free of its physical vessel, they experienced a moment of absolute clarity, a vision of the entire journey from beginning to end, from the first stirring of discontent to this final liberation, from the initial steps into the mist to this ultimate emergence into light. They saw how every experience had been necessary, how every challenge had served a purpose, how every apparent setback had been a hidden advancement. They saw the perfection of the design, the love that had guided every step, the wisdom that had orchestrated every encounter. And then they were in the crystal chamber once more, standing before the three sisters who smiled with the warmth of eternal welcome. But now they saw what they had not been able to see before, that the sisters were not separate beings but aspects of a single consciousness, that the chamber was not a place but a state of being, that the entire journey had been a journey within, an exploration of the infinite depths of their own true nature. "Welcome home," the sisters said, and their voice was the seeker's own voice, and the seeker was the sisters, and all separation dissolved into the unity that had always been the only reality. From this place of ultimate integration, the seeker, who was no longer a seeker but a finder, no longer a student but a master, no longer a part but the whole, looked back upon the world they had left. They saw their students gathered around the empty form, saw the tears and the smiles, the grief and the gratitude. They sent waves of love and reassurance, knowing that these would be felt even if not consciously recognized. They whispered guidance into receptive hearts, planted seeds of inspiration in fertile minds, strengthened the connections that would sustain the community through the transition. And they saw further, saw the ripples of their life spreading outward through time, touching lives they had never known, influencing events they could never have imagined. They saw students becoming teachers, sanctuaries becoming centers of transformation, the flame they had carried being passed from hand to hand across generations. They saw the slow but inexorable awakening of humanity, the gradual recognition of the unity that underlay all diversity, the eventual emergence of a civilization founded on wisdom and love rather than fear and separation. This vision filled them with a joy beyond anything they had known in mortal form, a joy that was not dependent on circumstances, that could not be diminished by any apparent setback, that was the very nature of existence itself when seen clearly. They understood now that this joy had always been available, had always been their birthright, had only been obscured by the veils of forgetting that were part of the human experience, and they understood that their task now was to help others remember, to shine the light of awakened consciousness into the darkness of sleeping minds, to call the dreamers to awaken. The journey continued, as it always had, as it always would. For consciousness knows no death, only transformation, no ending, only new beginning, no loss, only the eternal dance of forgetting and remembering, of sleeping and waking, of seeking and finding. And in that dance, every soul plays its part. Every life contributes its unique note to the cosmic symphony. Every moment of awareness adds to the ever-expanding tapestry of existence. The mists swirl eternally around the threshold between worlds, inviting all who are ready to begin the journey inward. The guardians wait with their challenges and their gifts, ready to test and to teach. The crystal chamber shines with the light of accumulated wisdom, ready to receive all who have earned the right to enter. And the three sisters sit upon their thrones of silver and shadow, ready to ask the question that has been asked since the dawn of consciousness and will be asked until its ultimate fulfillment. What do you seek? And the answer, when it comes from the depths of a sincere heart, is always the same. I seek myself. I seek the truth. I seek the way home. And the journey begins again, as it always has, as it always will, in the eternal spiral of awakening that is the purpose and the glory of existence itself. The mists part. The path appears. The first step is taken. And somewhere, in a realm beyond time, the three sisters smile, knowing that another soul has heard the call, another seeker has begun the journey, Another light is kindling in the darkness. The great work continues. The flame burns on, and the story, which has no beginning and no end, unfolds in its infinite beauty, forever and ever. World without end.